Hey, what's up? Pastor Matt here. Welcome to the ghost town that used to be my office. That's right, it looks like a zombie apocalypse happened here. All my books are off my shelves, all my pictures off the walls now. Of course, that's because we're leaving Faith Church here in Brooksville, Florida. We're headed up to Gospel Fellowship in Valencia, Pennsylvania, and this is my last week here in the office at Faith. My last sermon will be Sunday, July 21st, this coming Lord's Day, so it's a real weird week for me. But I wanted to take an opportunity to talk to you about sermon manuscript notes. We had an interesting conversation going online, those of us who are preachers, about our manuscripts, our notes, what we bring into the pulpit, full manuscript, outline, whatever. And so I thought I'd chime in on this discussion. Now, previously, you may have seen some of my videos where I talk about committing your manuscript to heart and delivering it freely from the pulpit, and that's exactly what I do. I am paradoxically a full manuscript guy and also a preach without notes guy. Now, I know that sounds like a contradiction, but that's what I do. I write out every week a full manuscript of about 2,500 words, of full sentences, full thoughts, almost like the chapter of a book. And what I find is that I almost never have any good new thoughts when I'm in the pulpit in front of a live congregation. My mind just doesn't work that way. I'm a prepare in the office guy. And so when I'm actually on my feet before real human beings, I just never come up with anything good. I just don't have any good ideas. My mind kind of freezes up. And so what I do is I prepare really hard during the week in the office, in the study. And so therefore, when I come to the pulpit on the Lord's Day morning, I'm able to speak much more freely and without the use, the dependence of my notes. Now, I do use them. I don't want to lead you on and say I don't use them at all. I do use them for direct quotes, for things I want to say very precisely, and for also checking where I am in the sermon, which we're going to see that in a moment. But as far as delivery goes, if you've ever seen my sermons on YouTube, I physically stand in front of the pulpit, and that's to reduce my dependence on my manuscript notes. I'm not constantly doing this. You know how awkward that is when a preacher does that 1,000 times. He's not really down here and he's not really out there. He's trying to straddle both worlds, and I found that that doesn't work for me. So it's full manuscript in the study and from the heart, free delivery from the pulpit. I know it's really hard to do that because you have to work really hard to prepare the manuscript in the week. You have to work really hard to commit it to your visual spatial memory. I'll explain that. And it's really hard to freely deliver in front of live people without feeling like you'll want to hide behind the manuscript or the sacred desk. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit pause on the video right now, and I'm going to take you over then to my end table, and we're actually going to have a look at some of my sermon manuscript notes that I would bring into the pulpit on the Lord's Day. So let me hit pause now, and I'll see you in just a second. Okay, here we are now, and we are now looking at some of the stuff that I bring with me physically into the pulpit on the Lord's Day. If I'm preaching from my pit minion, I might bring this little Amazon Basics sleeve, and if I do, I'm likely to just fold my sermon in half, keep it in here, and then bring it up to the pulpit with me. Some other things that I've used in the past, this really cool Puritan journal from For the King Trading Company, which was prepared for me by my friend Brock Childers, or even this larger portfolio for notes if I'm going to a conference and I have a lot of other things, bulletins or programs. I might bring my sermon up to the pulpit in this. But when I get to the pulpit, I take my 3 pages, and I always have 3. That's just something I do. And I will put them in this order. 1 and 2 I'm going to have out in front of me. Page 3 is going to be behind page 2, and therefore I'm only going to have to turn 1 page throughout the entire preaching of the sermon. I do not bring 7 or 8 or 10 pages into the pulpit. I've seen guys do that, and I think that's just a mess. It's really hard to keep flipping pages, and it keeps you from using your visual spatial memory as good as you possibly could. So here's what I mean by that. Let me put my 3 pages like this, just so you can see, even though I usually only have 2 out at a time. This represents my entire sermon, and as you can see, I've written out the entire thing in full. This is a full manuscript, And all of the main thoughts are going to be reduced to paragraphs. And so when I'm memorizing my sermon, I'm not memorizing word for word or line by line. I would really want to stress that. What I'm memorizing is thought block by thought block, idea by idea. And it's far easier to memorize a few ideas in order than it is to memorize thousands of words or hundreds of lines. And so, for instance, in this sermon, I started off with an illustration about dodgeball. And eventually I'm going to get into the complicated concept of election. But dodgeball is my opening gotcha hook. And so all I have to do, I don't have to memorize this story word for word or line by line. I'm just going to get out there and tell the thing about dodgeball from 5th grade. Anybody can remember that. And I've even drawn a little dodgeball here. So when I get up there, I remember, boom, first thing out the gate is my dodgeball illustration. Okay, and then my next paragraph is a transition about being chosen, what it's like to be chosen or to be passed over. And then we're going to get more and more into the sermon, the historical context of Deuteronomy 7, the doctrine of sovereign electing grace, and then on into my main points. Now, one of the things that you can see here is while I do draw little pictures on my sermon manuscripts from time to time, a little box here reminds me of my packing story. This U here represents a rather complicated philosophical concept that I'm going to get into explaining. Those little pictures that I draw simply help me to get that order of the sermon in my mind. And if I ever get lost, I don't have to read through lines to figure out where I am. I'm just going to look down and see some of the pictures and know where I'm at. Okay. Also, you're going to notice here some very limited use of highlighting. And that highlighting is very intentional on my part. The only things that I highlight in color are going to be my main points to the sermon. And like all good Presbyterian sermons, they always have 3 points, right? Well, not always, but a lot of times it works out that they do. So here are my 3 main points, 1, point 2, point 3, approximately 1 main point per page. And then towards the end of the sermon here, I have a couple of applications which are also highlighted. Now, I'm not a big, huge PowerPoint fan for preaching, although I do use it for teaching opportunities. But if you are a PowerPoint guy, the main points in color will also correspond to the things that I'm putting on the PowerPoint, just so the congregation can take notes if applicable. Okay, now a few other things about memorizing your manuscript that's going to be helpful in the pulpit. First of all, I would say make sure when you're writing that every paragraph is a very tight unit of thought. This is not like a book where you're really weaving ideas and intricacies together in the same paragraph like a good writer would. No, this is going to be very tightly focused on one idea per paragraph, and that way if I need to look down at all, which I really don't much at this point in my preaching career, that paragraph is simply going to remind me of a main idea. And that's why I've given each paragraph a bolded title. And so that even reduces my dependency less to have to focus on the actual words. I'm working through concepts at a time. So this paragraph is simply called Chosen, ? This one's called Historical Context. This one's called Doctrine, and so on. I have all the paragraphs are identified by some kind of a bolded title. And that, again, is to reduce my dependency on actually trying to read my manuscript when I'm preaching freely from the pulpit. Okay? So when I say I'm engaging my visual spatial memory to help me memorize my sermon manuscript, that's actually a very freeing idea, because probably if you thought about memorizing a sermon, you really thought about trying to memorize word for word and line for line. But if you get out of that habit and get into memorizing ideas in order, then you're much more easily going to be able to memorize a massive amount of content. And the visual spatial aspect has to do with where things are on the page. For instance, I know that my dodgeball illustration is up here on the top left, and I'm actually going to come back to that and conclude with that as a summarizing little capstone towards the end of the sermon right here. And I know that my first point is here, my last point is down here. I know that by the time I get to the U-shaped reality concept that I'm going to explain, that I'm halfway through my sermon, and I know that my main points are one on each page, and that just helps me to know where I'm at. And so when I'm out there preaching before the congregation, I can actually see these things in my mind. I can actually have kind of a picture of my manuscript in my mind. Of course, not all the words, but where the ideas are on the page. It's the same thing that happens to you when you know a passage in the Bible so well that you can actually tell where it is in the Bible, right? Like for instance, I know that John 3:16 is at a certain place in my Bible because my visual spatial memory reminds me that it's there. If you think of John 3:16 in your Bible, I'll bet you can tell exactly where it is. In mine, it's going to be on the left page, on the left column. And look, there it is. John 3:16, left page, left column. How did I know that? Well, it was my visual spatial memory. And you can use that to your advantage when you're working on your sermons, when you get your main ideas and you know where they are on the page. Okay? Well, that's just how I do it, and I know there's so many ways to do it. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your comments in the comments below. Also, I did want to mention these cool journals that Brock Childers makes for the King Trading Company. I'll post links to that in the description of this video. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on sermon manuscripting and outlining. All right, thanks for checking in. Love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.